So, Capcom's remake of Resident Evil 3 is barely more than a week old. It's a huge release. There was a lot of hype. I reviewed the game a couple of days ago. I'm sure a lot of you guys know. And you probably also know that it was a game that was met with some positivity, but also a lot of negativity. And a lot of people who felt that that game didn't truly deliver, there wasn't enough content, or it wasn't long enough or meaty enough of an experience. I, however, did have opposite feelings from that. I found the game to be pretty darned great. And I found it to be a worthy remake follow-up to last year's Resident Evil 2, which to me was almost a perfect game. And so here we are in a world where, in the course of 1 year, a little more than 1 year, we've seen two remakes of the Resident Evil series from Capcom, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. Way back in 2002, they also remade the original Resident Evil on the GameCube in what, in my opinion, is probably the second best Resident Evil game I've ever played, my second favorite. That game to me is a 10 out of 10. And so what that means is, over the course of 18 years, Capcom has remade the first three Resident Evil games, based on their original 90s versions on the PlayStation 1, Resident Evils 1, 2, and 3. Capcom has gone back and redone those games. But I'm sure you know the reason that we're talking about Resident Evil today, and that's because the remake train has not yet completely left the station, because now there are reports today on this random Sunday that Capcom is now planning a remake of Resident Evil 4. Yes, the seminal Resident Evil 4. In my opinion, I've said this before, my favorite Resident Evil game, and also one of my top 5 favorite video games of all time. The original release on the GameCube in January of 2005 is masterful. Absolutely masterful. It's not a perfect 10, because I've realized I don't think a game can be a perfect 10, because no game is perfect. But can a game still be 10 out of 10? For me, yes. I would give the game a 10 out of 10, even though it has some imperfections, just like every game does. Whatever your favorite game might be, it's not perfect, and it's okay to admit that, but maybe we can still qualify a game as a 10 out of 10. And so for me, Resident Evil 4, the original release, when I played it on the GameCube in 2005, is absolutely a 10 out of 10. The way I see it, the Resident Evil franchise sits in a really weird space right now, because we had the really amazing Resident Evil 2 remake last year, and then as we waited to hear what was going to happen next, there were a lot of people saying, oh, remake Resident Evil 3, remake Code Veronica, like, what a great idea, the remake of 2 was so cool, like, Capcom should just keep doing that. And that was a fine idea and had some excitement to it for sure, but at the same time, it had been a couple of years since we saw the last main new entry, Resident Evil 7, in 2017, a game that I also think was absolutely fantastic. Even though it was weird going into a Resident Evil mainline game knowing it was first person, I was still excited, and it turned out to be incredible. Like, it's not like my favorite Resident Evil by any stretch, but it was really, really good. And of course, it made me wonder where Resident Evil 8 might go. So after the Resident Evil 2 remake, when people were talking about remaking all of these other Resident Evil games, I was sitting here wondering where Resident Evil 8 was. And so when we found out that a little more than a year later, I should say, Capcom was going to be able to have remade the sequel Resident Evil 3, I was very confused. Yeah, I was excited because I wanted to have just another great remake, like Resident Evil 3 Bring It On, and as I said in my review, it's the classic Resident Evil game that I know the least about, so I had the most new to experience in Resident Evil 3 Remake, and that's partly why I also really enjoyed the game. But where was the next new game? Where was Resident Evil 8? Now, last week, there were a couple of rumors and stories floating out there that maybe Capcom is working on Resident Evil 8 to release really soon. So, okay, that hasn't been confirmed, but that certainly is exciting. I'll be excited to see what that turns into. But we come back to this Resident Evil 4 thing, and now we realize after a back-to-back release of Remake 2, Remake 3, now we're hearing that they're going to remake 4. And I'm just not sure why they're doing it, and I just don't know how I feel about it. Resident Evil 4 is in a unique situation when we consider this remake situation, and I'll go into that in a minute. But as far as the rumor, it originates from Video Games Chronicle, VGC, which is becoming kind of a staple outlet to talk about here on the channel, right? These guys have really been making a name for themselves, breaking scoops, I'd say the last almost year. We've talked about them several times on this channel because they did break a couple of pretty big stories and details about the development of Metroid Prime 4, my most anticipated game, obviously. And then only a couple of weeks ago, they were the source for the whole Mario remaster thing that kind of became a big story. Nintendo planning to release 3, 4, 5 remasters of some of their classic 3D Mario games throughout 2020. And that whole story came from VGC, so they've really been putting a lot of stuff out there. To be fair, the Mario thing has not yet been confirmed, and here they are talking about the Resident Evil 4 remake, and we don't know when this will be confirmed either. But they are the ones saying that this is supposed to be happening. Here's a couple of quick blurbs on their article about this story. They say development is being led by Osaka-based M2, the new studio founded by former Platinum Games head Tetsuya Minami, which has been preparing for the project since 2018. However, similar to how 2020's Resident Evil 3 was led by company Redworks, Capcom's internal teams and other external studios are likely to lend support. It's understood that the remake has the blessing of original game director Shinji Mikami, who officially declined an approach to lead the project himself, but has provided informal advice on its direction. So there's a couple of interesting tidbits and pieces of information we can glean from these couple of paragraphs here. It's very curious how they mention that M2 is the development team behind this, which of course was led by the former head of Platinum Games, and that's really interesting because Hideki Kamiya, who now works for Platinum Games, is, you know, one of the higher up people. He has a history with Capcom and with Resident Evil even, so it's just kind of interesting to see that stuff kind of go back and forth. And so here we are, where apparently, if this is something that turns out to be true, we're going to be getting now also a remake of Resident Evil 4. The article also states that right now they're targeting a 2022 release, which means that there would be, a year gap between 2020's Resident Evil 3 and 2022's Resident Evil 4. That does, as I pointed out on Twitter, leave 2021 open for a Resident Evil game if they wanted to do this annual back and forth swap thing. And obviously we would think that that would be Resident Evil 8. That would be a 4-year development between the end of Resident Evil 7 and the release of Resident Evil 8, if that turns out to be true. So I find that kind of interesting. And so if we dial back in here and I focus a little bit more on my opinion and takeaway from this whole concept, if this turns out to be true and Resident Evil 4 Remake is coming, how do I feel about it? I am mixed on this, you guys. I'm very conflicted internally about it because, as I said to you at the beginning here, it's not only my favorite Resident Evil game, it's one of my all-time favorite games. Resident Evil 4, to me, is that good. It's a 10 out of 10, as I said. And so one would maybe think that remaking that game would be really exciting to me. And, it is a little bit. Of course, part of me is very excited to play a newer, updated, potentially better version of a game that's 15 years old. I mean, again, 2005, the game is 15 years old. So sure, updating it would probably be very exciting. But I'm also mixed because I feel like of these games that they've been remaking, this is probably one that doesn't need to really be remade. Yes, it could probably be improved. It's not like if you go back and play Resident Evil 4 for the first time today, you're not going to be like, wow, this game is old and it feels, kind of janky and it's awkward and the pacing might be weird or whatever. Who knows? You're going to know that you're playing an older game if you played it for the first time today, sure. But it's pretty obvious that when you compare the original 2005 Resident Evil 4 to the original mid-90s releases of Resident Evils 1, 2, and 3, they're on completely different planes. There are completely different worlds between the quality of 4 and the quality of the original releases of the first 3, because they're from different eras and different generations. The capability and the technicality of Resident Evil 4 today holds up much, much, much better in even 2020 than the PlayStation 1 versions of the original 3 games ever could hope to. I mean, those games, as much as I loved them when I played them, they found themselves in more of an ideal situation to be remade in a modern way. And with Resident Evil 4, I just don't think it's that way. In fact, here's one of the biggest reasons. The original 3 PlayStation 1 Resident Evil games were from the static camera tank control era. And I will say this, and I know I am alone in saying this, but I love that way to play Resident Evil, and I yearn for it to come back, okay? I would love nothing more than for Capcom to make a new Resident Evil game where they made static camera and they gave us an option for tank controls. They could use modern controls in the static camera, but then also give us options for tank controls, which is what they did with the 2014 version of the Resident Evil 1 remake, and it worked really well. And so I would love them to bring that back. However, most people do not like that. They don't enjoy it. And to be fair, it's a very dated way to play a game like Resident Evil, okay? Resident Evil 4, though, the original 2005 release, marks a huge change in how Resident Evil games and third-person action games were made, because it was the game that made it so that you're not living in like a static camera angle environment. We're in a full 3D environment and we have control over the camera and our character. It wasn't really the first game to do exactly what it did, of course, a lot of you guys know, but it was the first game to make an impact the way it did. And it absolutely changed the face of Resident Evil games, and it changed the face of shooter games and third-person action, adventure, and shooter games. It was the game-changing moment, was Resident Evil 4. And so you realize the advantage to remaking Resident Evil 1, this remake doesn't count, because in 2002, they remade it with the same static camera angle style of the original release. But with Resident Evils 2 and 3, done in only, the late 20-teens, right? These games, those remakes kind of needed to happen more, because they took them from the static camera angle environment and put them into the 3D camera environment that Resident Evil 4 popularized and solidified as the ideal way to play these kinds of games. Even though, again, I say ideal because the mass thinks that it's ideal. I like the static camera stuff, so I'm not talking about me. I'm acknowledging the larger audience and the fact that most people like it a different way. They like the 3D camera style of Resident Evil 4 and the 2 and 3 remake, and so that's fine. And so this whole, long tangent I'm going on here is me just explaining why remaking 2 and 3 the way they did in the modern engine made more sense than remaking 4. Because the modern engine is just a better version of what 4 already is. And people already consider 4 to be a great game. No one is really asking for this game to be remade. In fact, the biggest responses we're seeing to the story is that it doesn't necessarily make sense. Why are you remaking 4? It's already great. We don't need it to be remade. And in fact, there's another game people want remade instead. And that brings me to one of the other reasons I'm conflicted about this, is that if you're going to remake another Resident Evil game, why not remake Code Veronica? It's a really great game, technically a spin-off, and it's unique because it was actually supposed to be Resident Evil 3. Nemesis was going to be the spin-off game, and they ended up swapping roles, and they added the 3 to Resident Evil Nemesis, and so that became Resident Evil 3. But Code Veronica is a really good game, and that probably could hold up without a remake, but I also think that because it's still a good, 4 or 5 years, I think, before Resident Evil 4 came out, that game probably more qualifies in that old school era that would more justify a modern remake, again, than Resident Evil 4 would. So if you're going to say, should we remake Code Veronica, should we remake Resident Evil 4, I and a lot of Resident Evil fans will tell you remake Code Veronica first. It's the older game, it's the more unknown and underappreciated game, it's the game with the smallest audience, so you could introduce it to the newest people, so remake Code Veronica. I prefer Resident Evil 4 to Code Veronica any day of the week. I mean, again, one of my favorite games. But that doesn't mean it's the game that needs the remake more. Truly, it is Code Veronica if Capcom is just going to continue this Resident Evil remake, charade that they're on. And, I of course am liking these remakes, but are they maybe getting too focused on this? I would say yes. With this news about a Resident Evil 4 remake, and again, if we get it confirmed, it seems like it's a real thing, but let's remind ourselves it's not confirmed yet. So if this gets confirmed, I'm at the point where it's like, okay, Capcom, you're doing great with these. Resident Evil 2 and 3 are amazing remakes. These games are awesome, so I'm glad they exist. But Capcom, maybe you need to slow your roll. You're probably making Resident Evil 8. We all basically know you are. Focus on a new Resident Evil game. And then you just made a new Devil May Cry game. Maybe go back to making Devil May Cry 6. People want Dino Crisis to come back in some form. Beautiful Joe, holy crap, bring that back in some form. Okami. Or, heaven forbid, new IPs, you know? Onimusha is another classic one they can come back to. So it's like there's other things besides Resident Evil they could be focusing on. I mean, they gave us Mega Man 11 a couple years ago too, which I really liked. So that was good. But they need to do more things. And I say this as the biggest Resident Evil fan. Like, it's one of my favorite franchises. But I've got enough Resident Evil to enjoy. I just had 2 great remakes. I'm expecting a Resident Evil 8 soon. I don't need anything else right now, Capcom. We good, okay? Us Resident Evil fans, I think I speak for a lot of us when I say we're good. If you're making Resident Evil 8, we're in great shape. You don't need to remake Resident Evil 4. It's fine. You know, and I'll say this here. I'll end the video here. I'll say this one thing. After all my ranting about us not needing the game, will I buy it? Yes. Okay, so maybe that's a little bit hypocritical. I'm not a monster. Of course, I'm going to buy a remake of one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. I'm going to do it. And if anything, bare minimum, we've learned that Capcom is damn good at making these remakes. So I don't expect it to be a bad game. Here's the thing. We don't need a Resident Evil 4 remake. I'm not asking for it. But are they going to make a great game if they do it? Yeah, and so of course, I'm gonna buy it. So yeah, what are you gonna do, man? I'm only human, I am only one gamer, and I'm a passionate and nostalgic dude, so yeah, I'm gonna give in. Even though I'm not telling Capcom to make this game, I'm gonna give in, because I'm a sucker, what can I say? I'm part of the problem, I guess, but I don't care. It's my money to spend how I want to spend it. So that's what's going on. That's the whole thing with the Resident Evil 4 remake right now. Capcom is apparently on a mission. They have a vision, and this is just what they want to do. None of us can stop it. The only way we could stop it is if we stopped buying these remakes, and I don't think any of us expect that to happen, so it is what it is. It's not the worst news. It's fine. A remake of an amazing game, sure. It's okay. It's not bad news. It's more just a weird choice where I think they could be making different, better choices instead. That's kind of the way I see it. So those are my thoughts and opinions on this. What do you guys think? Are you excited? Are you not? Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? Maybe you don't even care about Resident Evil, in which case, why would you even be watching this video to the end? That's what I have to say about that. So share your thoughts and opinions below. And with that, this video is a wrap. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Rule of Two Review, and I will catch you next time on another video.